Okay, so moving on. We are going to week 9, which was just November 5th and November 6th. Remember, we had election day and that little synergy outage. So there's 2 things we're going to be looking at. Our assignments, which is what you're going to be writing on, and the PowerPoint. So I'll be flipping back and forth between the 2, okay? So first, our warm-up was complete the Freire model for the word adapt. Now, how can you complete this? We're going to look up the definitions. Definition for adapt. Oops. So, adapt. Make something suitable for a new use or purpose. So, what are some characteristics of adapting? So, learning a new skill, changing your wardrobe, you're adapting to the weather. So, when it becomes winter, you start wearing warmer clothes, you start, using blankets at night. Examples: we all had to adapt to the pandemic and social distancing rules and learning virtually. So, non-examples. So, people who refuse to adapt, people who refuse to wear masks, or people who still wear shorts and flip-flops in the winter. So, this is going to count as our warm-up grade. So, fill this in, pause if you need to, and then we'll move on. Next, we have our a outline of the Great Plains. So when we talk about the geographic region, it's going to be the geographic region that is the Great Plains. We're talking about this yellowed area, and it encompasses parts of the states of Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, South Dakota, Montana, and North Dakota. So its physical features include flat lands that rise gradually from east to west, because the farther west we get, the closer we get to the Rocky Mountains and then the Sierra Nevada. So we got all this flat land because the only mountains we have are the Appalachians up here, and then it just gets flat and flat. But slowly, as we move from east to west, we get that gradual rise because we're getting closer to the Rocky Mountains. Then we have land eroded by wind and water. So the Great Plains are plains. They don't have a lot of trees. Now, besides providing shade and just being pretty cool, trees actually help the soil because it blocks the wind from getting to the soil. When you only have a bunch of grass, that topsoil is going to be easily exposed and it's going to blow away. There's nothing to really hold it in place. And what's important to remember about that is because all the topsoil is getting blown away, that's where all the nutrients is. So you might have talked about decay and decomposition and life cycles in science. So the Great Plains weren't really suitable for many crops because when things die and send nutrients back into the soil, it starts that top layer. That top layer is continuously getting blown away by the wind that's coming. So it doesn't really have those nutrients. And to get the fruit-bearing vegetables, like cucumbers, tomatoes, things like that, they require a lot of nutrients and a lot of water, which is the next thing. There's not a lot of rain. And there's frequent dust storms. So if you haven't seen it, you look up dust storms on YouTube and see it, get a nice visual of what a dust storm is. Okay. So, our summary. Before the Civil War, most Americans saw the Great Plains as a treeless wasteland. New inventions and adaptations helped to change people's perceptions. They began to see the Great Plains as a vast area to be settled. So, an example of the new technologies was sod houses. Now, you're going to fill in treeless wasteland. So before the Civil War, Americans saw Great Plains as a treeless wasteland. New inventions and adaptations helped to change people's perceptions. They began to see the Great Plains as a vast area to be settled. Then we're just going to recount those physical features we talked about. So the physical features: flat lands that rise gradually from east to west, low rainfall, frequent dust storms, and land eroded by wind and water. So you'll fill in those 3 blanks right here as well. And that's it for slide 3. And once you get those, move on. You can pause here to fill in slide 3. Okay, slide 4. And bounce back to my PowerPoint. Following the Civil War, Americans began moving west in large numbers for several reasons. Opportunities for land ownership, as an attempt to encourage people to move west. Well, one of the reasons they moved west was the opportunities for land ownership. To encourage people to move west, the government passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of land if the settlers stayed on the land for 5 years. And it wasn't just, single people. The people who were taking advantage of the Homestead Act were families. They weren't single men. The single men were all going west to California. They wanted the gold. And in order to build these things, you had to have other labor. It wasn't just mom and dad building the houses. They got everybody working, even little Sally Sue, 2 years old. She can be digging up some sod to make the sod houses. So for your slide 4 on your assignment, you write opportunities for land ownership. In an attempt to encourage people to move west, the government passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of land to settlers if they stayed on the land for 5 years. Then we'll move on. So, following the Civil War, Americans began moving west in large numbers for several reasons. B, reason number 2, numero dos. Technological advances such as the Transcontinental Railroad made life easier on the Great Plains. So not only was the Transcontinental now connecting the East Coast to the West Coast, people were developing new technologies to make farming more sustainable on this previous wasteland. So because there were no trees, they were adopting sod houses, which is building your house out of clay, a clay type material. Once it hards, it's kind of like a brick. So brick houses. They had windmills. I know we associate windmills now with electricity, but before it was to pull water up from underground sources of water. So they're called aquifers. There are a couple other names, but water that's like a river, pond underground. They'd pull up the water, and then that's how they got water because there wasn't a lot of rain. And of course, people are building with sod houses, so that the soil in the Great Plains is very thick. It's very hard. Old wooden plows aren't doing, so they need those steel plows. And then we have barbed wire. What became popular was not only wheat growing in the Great Plains, but also cattle raising, because cows will eat pretty much any kind of grass, and they need a lot of it, which is where we get the cowboys. Then here is the example of the Transcontinental Railroad. We got the Iron Horse, as they called it. So going back to what you're filling in, let's just look. We have B, technological advances such as the Transcontinental Railroad made life easier on the Great Plains. Then we had hope for wealth. Oops, getting ahead of myself. So we had hope for wealth from gold and silver mining. Now, this is where you're going to see a lot of the single men, these gold rush towns popping up that are now ghost towns. This is where the single people went. And it's going to cause a lot of problems later on, as far as just crime and stuff, That's where we get the cowboys, the Texas Rangers, all that crime on the West, people running, because the government hadn't really established itself. Plus, there were already people living in the West, right? The Native Americans were like, yo, what are you doing? Why are you here? Honestly, I can't even explain why we all like shiny rock so much. We're like a bunch of crows. Then, of course, some people just came for fun. You're single, you don't have anything to do. Some people, they have that personality. They have that desire for adventure. It wasn't just men, it was women too. So D is going to be adventure. Oops, no. Then E. It was a new beginning for former slaves. Many were hoping to escape discrimination in the South. As you can see here, we got a family making their sod house. They got their horses, all their children, which was quite common, because you needed people to work the lands. And this says all colored people that want to go to Kansas on September 5th, 1877 can do so for $5, which still cheap considering what they were doing, but not really cheap for back then dollars. So we got a new beginning for former slaves. Many were hoping to escape discrimination in the South. Now, so we are going to get on to slide 5, technological advances, which are the inventions and adaptations that made it easier for people to live in the harsh environment that was the Great Plains. So, steel plows for cutting through the thick sod. Wooden plows were too weak for the plains sod. So, A, steel plows for cutting through thick sod. B, windmills provided water. The windmill pumped valuable water from the deep underground. So B is windmill. C is sod houses because of limited wood supplies. There weren't trees on the Great Plains, so it was really expensive to ship in. So they had to use new resources. It could be like this single guy kind of living in a hollowed out type of thing. Not very fancy. The single lady's got a pretty nice one. This family who has a bunch of, looks like boys, ages maybe 10 to 15. That's some muscle. Be able to build a really nice house for yourself. And then you got a family over here. Looks like they got a lot of young children. Not so fancy, but still I think nicer than this dude's. So we got sod houses for C. D, barbed wire to contain farm animals. Secured livestock and kept animals out of farmlands. So barbed wire to contain farm animals. So remember, we talked about that the topsoil is getting blown away. So it's not a very nutrient-dense soil that the Great Plains have. So they developed wheat farming. It was a tough crop that could survive on the plains. And it used less water than most because it's not making those fruits or those vegetables like we know. It doesn't have to grow a cucumber. It just kind of grows like a grass. So E is wheat farming. And then we have dry farming. Seeds were planted deep in the ground, which was closer to the underground water. And also the harsh sun, if it's deeper underground, the water is going to trickle down and it's not going to get as, it's not as exposed to the sun. And that top layer is always going to be dry and the water is going to evaporate from it. So that's why they did deep farming, because the farther under means they could water less because that water would stay. It wouldn't get evaporated. G, railroads moved people, products, supplies, which was essential for settling the Great Plains. So, railroads moved people, products, supplies, which was essential for settling Great Plains. Then beef cattle raising. Cattle thrived on the plain side and were tough enough to withstand the harsh environment. So, just keep in mind, there's different types of cows that are used for beef than they are for dairy. If you want something to make a lot of milk, you need a lot of water for it. So they could do with less water and more food because you want the meat, not the milk. And that will finish up slide 5. Then we have slide 6. So, the Transcontinental Railroad connected the East Coast with the West Coast of the United States. 1,770 miles of track was completed on May 10, 1869, transforming life across America. So A, transportation improved, allowing people to easily move around the country. The traveling from one end of America to the other would take months by horse. Railroads completed the trip in 1 or 2 days. So A, transportation improved. B, goods, supplies can now be shipped quickly and effectively to most areas of the United States. Trains allowed valuable supplies, like wood, to reach destinations that needed them, like the Great Plains that didn't have trees. So, B, goods and supplies could now be shipped quickly. C, communication improved, helping to link the country and draw us closer together. So now you could go visit your cousin in Georgia or your cousin in Boston. So communication improved, helping us to link the country and draw us closer together. Okay, so now we have our last slide, which you're going to do independently. So there are 4 physical features of the climates of the Great Plains. You're going to either fill it in with a picture for erosion, find something on Google that describes erosion by wind and water. And then what is this physical feature? You can use slide 2. What's the physical feature that goes from east to west? You'll write it here. Then what is this? You'll give the physical feature here and then find something that says low, a picture that represents low rainfall. Okay, so, and word summary. Now, I know this was a long video, a long lesson, but you're going to write a summary about what you learned. So each word costs 10 cents. Don't go over $2. So in 20 words or less, describe what we talked about today. And then hit that turn in button